hearing from Bonnie Flint. She will be presenting how to measure wild animal welfare. Dr. Flint completed her PhD at the Virginia Tech Department of Biological Sciences, studying behavioral ecology, physiological ecology, and disease ecology of banded mongooses in Botswana. And she has worked on varied projects in ecology and conservation, and spent many years in science education, teaching introductory biology and anatomy and physiology. So Dr. Flint, we are excited to have you.
Thank you very much. I'm happy to be here. Let me do as everyone does and share my screen. All right. Thank you, An, for introducing me, and thank you to all of you for being here. Dave gave us some great examples of ways to get a grasp of animal welfare in the field, and he was focusing on the physiological stress and measurements of stress and fear. And so I'm going to be talking about some promising measures of welfare that don't directly measure physiological stress. I'll mention a couple of those, but I'm going to try to stick a little bit more to the valence of the animal's subjective state. So let's start with a reminder. I know that you've probably had a reminder after for every single one of these talks, but just to kind of give you a quick reminder of how we at Wild Animal Initiative think about the framework that we use to think about welfare and emotions. So our definition is the valenced affective state of an animal over a given period of time. So this has very much to do with their emotions, and we kind of focus on the goodness or the badness that an animal is mentally experiencing. So as this graph shows, we like to use a framework where emotions are mapped onto axes, although those are not the only two characteristics that emotions can have. This is just a couple of the characteristics. So on this horizontal axis, we have valence, and on the vertical axis, we have arousal. So the animal is going to have variation in these over time, both arousal and valence. But we would consider good welfare to be that in which the animal is mostly experiencing the positive side of this valence axis. And arousal is going to vary. We generally consider it to be less important on its own for welfare than valence. So before you decide what to measure, you have to kind of think about a number of things. So first, you need to know your study species. So this includes things like understanding its anatomy, physiology, behavior. So for example, if let's say you're doing a study in bees, here's this lovely little bee over here, you can't measure blood cortisol level in bees because they don't have cortisol. And actually, they don't really have blood. They have hemolymph. So you're not going to measure blood cortisol in a bee, but there are other things that you can measure in a bee. So you need to know about your animal in kind of the most basic sense, of course. But also you need to think about what is actually feasible for your species. And we know that feasibility is a huge factor in the field, much more so than in captive animals. So as an example, for some species, it might be really easy to collect fecal samples and extract data from those fecal samples. So for example, elephants. It's not hard to find elephant poop if you live around elephants. Whereas for other species, it might be really, really difficult. Like for mice, they have tiny poop. They often poop underground or in a tree. So really, really hard to find their fecal samples, and their fecal samples are very, very small. Now, on the other hand, some species may be very easy to trap and handle, like mice, not too hard to get them in a trap and handle them and then let them go. But for others, it might be too dangerous or expensive or logistically complicated or distressing to the animal, like elephants. So based on your animal, you need to pick a method that is feasible. And even thinking about how easily observable your species is needs to be considered. So some, it might be very easy to record them remotely. And for others, they might be super reclusive and hard to find, and you can't do that. So in addition to knowing your species, you need to think about your time scale. If you're hoping to understand the welfare impact of some particular event or challenge in the animal's life, then you need to think about indicators that measure welfare at that same time scale as that event. So on the other hand, maybe you're interested in the cumulative welfare impact of something over the full lifetime of the animal. Then you need to look at an indicator that measures cumulative welfare rather than instantaneous welfare. So you have to think about the time scale of both your X and your Y variables and make sure that you're measuring at the time scale of interest for your particular study. So for example, if I want to know about the animal's valence state right now while it's eating some preferred food, I am probably not going to measure telomeres because that so far we know is indicative of cumulative welfare over the course of the animal's life. Instead, an indicator such as qualitative behavioral assessment is more likely to tell me about the animal's state right now. And don't worry, I'm going to talk about both of those indicators in a little while. Another thing that you want to make sure of is that you have the actual capacity to collect and analyze the data you'd like to collect. I'm not going to go into detail here because if you've done science, you already know that you need to do these things basically for every study. But it is important to be realistic at the outset of what you're going to be able to accomplish. And in a lot of ways, that relates to the level of disturbance that you're creating for the animal. So you wouldn't want to collect extra data that disturbs the animal that you won't actually be able to use. If you're researching wild animal welfare out of concern for wild animals, or even if you're not concerned for wild animals, you should be asking yourself, what are the least distressing methods I can use for this study while still collecting the data that I require? Now, I'm sure that you're going to have an ethics review of some sort, but many of these institutional committees are not particularly stringent. So you might set a more conservative limit for yourself than they set. While any method of evaluation is likely to impact the welfare of your subjects in some way, you may be able to come up with methods that collect the same or similar data in a much less distressing way. So for example, maybe you can use hair traps instead of trapping the entire animal to collect a hair sample, or perhaps you can use remote video cameras instead of observing them in person. The 3 R's, replacement, reduction, and refinement, are a good place to start. And we heard from Miriam in the first, I think it was in the first workshop. So if you haven't yet, I hope that you will visit her website and look again at the 3 R's. And the benefits to considering these are not only to the animal, as you can see in this diagram from her website, it's also beneficial to you. Okay, so those are the things that we hope you'll take into consideration before you decide on what measure you're going to use. Now I'm going to be giving you some examples of ways to measure welfare. We use a framework of 2 different types of measures. There are indicators and there are metrics. And both of these allow us to infer something about the subjective excuse me, welfare experience of the individual. So the range of emotional responses to an external or internal factor that's happening to them. Indicators and metrics allow us sort of a window of insight into those experiences as they are perceived by the animal. So what's the difference between these? Indicators, to put very simply, are just the measured variables that tell us something about welfare. There are several different types of indicators. So we have whole animal indicators, and this is an indicator that's aimed at directly providing sort of a holistic picture of the individual in full. We want this to incorporate across the different components for welfare into their sort of overall experience, their mood, their emotional state, and sometimes it also gives us insight into their state of arousal. So whole animal indicators attempt to provide information across the valence spectrum with a single type of measurement. It may or may not give us information about arousal. It's unlikely to give information about the factors that are affecting welfare, like the causes such as diminishing health or something along those lines. But, and it might not be perfect across the full spectrum, but it is a more holistic measure rather than measuring just one single cause. So partial indicators, these are sort of like the opposite. They represent only a single component of welfare or a single cause or a single effect of that component of welfare. So an example might be, it only represents negative affect. It doesn't show you anything about positive affect. So to illustrate this with a little more depth, you might measure the disease load and health symptoms of an animal, and that is going to show you the elements of health that are impacting welfare. It doesn't tell you about the social situation or the resources available to the animal. So it's just that one single aspect of welfare. A partial indicator might give us one component of the welfare condition, and if we use many partial indicators together, then that can give us a more holistic picture for inferring the causes of positive and negative welfare. And partial indicators have to be used in combination. They are not sufficient as a single indicator to tell us everything that we would want to know about welfare. I have environmental indicators on here, but I put a little asterisk because these are partial indicators that assess a resource or a challenge, such as, let's say, food availability or predation, from which welfare is inferred. These lack a direct relationship to valence, so you're not measuring how the animal is doing. And therefore, a lot of researchers consider them to be sort of like welfare risk indicators, or they might be sort of alerting you to potential welfare problems or potential good welfare. So they aren't going to directly measure those welfare states, but they give you an idea of something that could be affecting the welfare states. So those are our three types of indicators. And as I said before, the other type of measure that we can use are called metrics. I've lost there I am. Metrics are frameworks that try to combine a lot of different partial indicators and output some sort of single readout. Sometimes these are welfare scores. Sometimes they're not exactly a score, but they're something similar to it. And these are indicators for, these indicators for the metric can be either qualitative or quantitative or a combination of both. So here I'm going to relate these measures to the valence and arousal graph we showed before. So, these got switched. So these axes are switched, but this is still valence on the horizontal axis, and this is arousal on the vertical axis. So for example, these gray points are partial indicators. So let's say that we have an indicator that's really good at showing us when an animal has a negative valence. So you might have, it might give you something within like these 2 points and other things on this side of the graph. So, okay, we know when this animal has negative valence when we use this partial indicator. And this partial indicator may or may not give us information about arousal. Now, another partial indicator may be good at giving us these 2 data points. So let's say it's a good indicator of positive arousal, right? So, okay, we know that it's going to be above this x-axis whenever we're getting data points here with this particular indicator. So you can, sort of so on, you can imagine other indicators showing us other parts of the graph, and combining these, we might get some sort of overall idea of what is happening with welfare and the things that are affecting welfare. Now, a whole animal indicator is going to provide data more along this horizontal axis with one single type of measurement, as shown in the dotted line. It might not do it evenly for both negative and positive valence. We would kind of like for it to, but no measure is completely perfect. And the other thing about a whole animal measure, it may or may not tell you something about arousal. And it's also, unlike the partial indicators, it's very unlikely to give you information about what is actually affecting the welfare. It's just telling you what the welfare is. Now, a metric is going to combine multiple partial indicators. So just like we said before, if we take a whole bunch of different types of partial indicators, we have an overall idea, but what the metric does is actually take that data, sort of put it into some sort of framework. It might be an algorithm, it might just be tabulating it and doing some type of scoring, and give you sort of one single readout that gives you an idea about the overall welfare of the individual. It will also give you an idea of the types of factors that are affecting welfare, because each of the partial measures gives you those ideas. So hopefully that gives you an idea of the types of measures that exist and sort of the way that we classify them. And now I'm going to drill down into some of those measures themselves. So I'm going to start first with partial behavioral indicators. So it's important to remember, for every partial indicator, you have to use them with other indicators because they're only giving you insight into one aspect of welfare. Okay, so one example, and Dave talked about the physiological aspects of this, but fear has a lot of behaviors that go along with it. So for example, vigilance levels, neophobia, so that can be measured by how long it takes an animal to approach a novel object, those types of things. And while these behaviors are influenced by the personality of the animal, they're also plastic enough that they will change based on the environment, and welfare kind of changes along with that. So an example of this is, let's say predation risk increases. So some new predators come into your area. This is going to increase your fear, and that fear has a negative valence. So your welfare is going to become more negative And we should be able to see this maybe with increased vigilance and those types of things. Another partial indicator is play behavior. This has been used a lot in captive species, but it's only going to be useful in species that actually play, and not all species play. And some species only play when they're very young. So this is definitely one, not a universal indicator. You need to really think about whether or not it is going to work for your species. Play has typically been used as an indicator of positive welfare, but it's also something to be careful of because sometimes it occurs under poor welfare conditions. So it's causally complex. And so, for example, if there's a lot of social tension or a lot of stress, the animal might play kind of as a way to release some of that. It's kind of like with humans, we smile and laugh when we're happy, but we also do it for a lot of other reasons. So if there's a sudden release from a stressful situation, this can cause what is called rebound play. During social tension, play can be used as an appeasement behavior, or in response to nervousness or ongoing stress, it can be a displacement behavior. So the context of play needs to be well understood in the species under study to determine if it is truly indicating that positive valence. And it, of course, as all of these partial indicators, it needs to be used in conjunction with other indicators. Another specific behavior that can be measured as a partial indicator is social interactions. Now, this is going to vary tremendously depending on species, but in many gregarious species, they have both positive and negative types of social interactions that can give us insight into the welfare of individuals. So we can group those into agonistic and affiliative categories, and they can indicate a small aspect of positive and negative welfare, but they're not going to respond to every single change in valence. So once again, they're still partial indicators. There are a lot of other behaviors that can be potential partial indicators. And as I said at the beginning, knowing your species is really important in deciding which of these types of behaviors is actually something that your species does and that is feasible for you to measure. So they are not universal indicators. They're going to vary in their feasibility, in their reliability, in their informativeness based on the species. And they are also going to vary in how well they measure valence versus arousal. So now I'm going to talk about still on behaviors, but looking more at whole animal indicators. So some behavioral indicators are considered whole animal measures, meaning that they provide a more holistic impression of the welfare of the animal. So we can use them as a more comprehensive indicator of welfare, but they can vary in the range of valence that they represent. So again, they still should not be used completely by themselves, but they do give you a broader range within the valence. So one really, to me, intriguing potential whole animal indicator is qualitative behavioral assessment. It has been validated in several captive species, but there are no published results on any wild species yet. So I think that this would be one that could be quite feasible in many, many species in the wild. QBA for short is kind of like the how of behavior rather than the what. And what does that mean? So it's not asking specifically what behaviors are being performed, but rather how are those behaviors being performed. So it's sort of the expressive quality of the behavior. Now, some people argue this seems like very subjective. And to a certain extent, it can be, but humans, along with many other animals, have evolved to read the emotions of others in order to help us predict the behavior of that individual and allow us to react appropriately. So, for example, is this bear going to eat me? Is this dog that's approaching me friendly or menacing? Right? So we need to understand more than just what the animal is doing, but how it is doing that. And unfortunately, I don't think I have time to go into the details of how this method is carried out. But I hope that you will read up on QBA and see if it's something that you might want to validate for your species. I'd be really excited to see people start using this for wild animals. It does generally require some familiarity with the species that's under study. So it might be best if you use it for a species you've been studying for extended period of time rather than species that you've never watched in the wild. It's also going to be easier to use this method on species that are more similar to us. So for example, maybe other mammals and even birds, rather than maybe on insects. I'm not sure that we would be able to understand the expressive nature of, let's say, a beetle. Not that they necessarily don't have them. It's just not something that we're really clued into very well. So another indicator that can potentially help us to understand that fuller range of valence is activity and inactivity budgets. And basically, these are just telling us how the animal is spending their time. And activity budgets are quite common in behavioral ecology. But one thing that we need to add in from animal welfare is a particular type of inactivity that's associated with negative valence. And we could describe this as being withdrawn from the environment rather than just resting. So this type of withdrawal can be an indicator of poor welfare, whereas resting might be an indicator of good welfare. And so this type of withdrawal behavior has potential to indicate depression-like states. So when we create ethograms, I, as a behavioral ecologist, have done these before, and never before have I included this type of withdrawn inactive behavior. Although I did see that type of behavior in sick animals. So I think it's really important to add that to our activity budgets for the purposes of wild animal welfare research. Another whole animal indicator, and this is going to be the last one that I talk about because I want to get to all the different types, is cognitive bias tests. There are two main kinds. We have judgment bias, and this is commonly used as a welfare indicator in captive animals. However, it requires pretty extensive training of the animal, and so it's not going to be feasible for, I would probably say, most wild animals. And then the other type of cognitive bias test is attention bias. And this might be more feasible in wild animals. And this is basically where the animal is going to have, the animal is going to pay more attention to negative things if it is in a negative welfare state, and vice versa. And so you can put out things that should have negative or positive responses and see, for example, how long the animals look at that particular thing. So that's kind of how attention bias works. It hasn't received a lot of attention within animal welfare in captive animals, but I think it could be something that is much more useful in wild animals, since we can't do all of the training that is necessary for judgment bias for most wild animal species. So once again, I just want to remind you, we're calling all of these whole animal measures, but again, it's always wise to have more than one indicator that you're looking at. So while these kind of give you a more holistic view of the animal and it gets closer to representing the full spectrum of valence, they're not going to be as informative about what is influencing welfare. And no measure is going to be completely error proof. So we suggest always using multiple measures to provide a more robust understanding of the animal's welfare. Okay, so now we're going to move on to physiology, and we'll start with partial physiological indicators. The list of potential partial indicators that are physiologically based is rather long right now, but many of these have not been validated, or they come with a lot of caveats. So I'm going to talk about a few of these that have a lot of promise, or that are already sort of highly discussed and used. My dog has just entered the room. So first, I'm combining, oh, and again, these have to be used with other indicators. So first, I've combined injury, disease, and parasitism into sort of one lump. And basically what I'm meaning here is anything that impairs an animal and or produces some sort of immune response. These typically make pretty good partial indicators because things that cause symptoms or impair normal functions are very likely to cause a decrease in welfare. However, lack of injury or disease or parasitism is not going to guarantee good welfare, so that's why these are only partial indicators. And I like to note that it's important to try to measure the symptoms of the impairments, not only the impairments themselves. So let me explain what that means. So you can get quantitative measurements of disease like the viral load or the bacterial load or the parasite load. You can get immune measures like antibody titers. And those are all important and useful pieces of information. But different animals may react differently to the very same viral load, for example. So some might be severely sick in great discomfort, and others might be totally asymptomatic with no noticeable welfare reduction despite being infected. So measuring things like lethargy, impairment of movement, withdrawal from the environment. This is a banded mongoose who was withdrawn from the environment, very much so. Even things like mucus production, those might be more qualitative. For example, you have to create a 1 to 5 scale for lethargy. But they might give you more insight about welfare than viral load alone. So using symptoms and the causes of impairment together is a better combination than using one of them by itself. Hormones. There are a lot of different hormones we can use. Things like oxytocin and prolactin and testosterone have been shown to vary with welfare in some studies. And there's neuroscience that shows the biological links between affect, like within the brain itself, and these hormones. But there still is a lot of work to do to validate those things. So there's potential there, but it hasn't been sort of well used, and certainly not validated in wild animals. Now, another option that Dave Diversa talked about are various physiological stress measures. However, as was brought up in the chat after Dave's talk, it's very important to understand that animals can have a physiological stress response, but still have positive welfare. So like a nice surprise might cause a physiological stress response, but cause positive valence. We think perhaps the physiological stress response would be more aligned with emotional arousal than it is with valence. So it's really important to be very careful how these measures are used, and it should be really well thought out and very well validated in every species that it's used in. I could give, and I have given, an entire talk just about the uses and caveats specifically of glucocorticoids and other measures of physiological stress. But I don't want to spend too much time on these because I want to have time to talk about other types of measures. So I'll just say, please be very careful when you're using these. And if you would like to talk to somebody about it, please feel free to get in touch with me or somebody at Y if you want more information about their potential uses and misuses. So one example of physiological stress that I don't think Dave had time to talk about are core or surface temperature. So that's what we're looking at here with this nice little GIF that Paul Jerem provided to us. This has been validated in some endotherms, and it seems to correspond well with various stress indicators. And there are currently some studies in progress where eye temperature of birds, you can see right there, is being measured as a partial welfare indicator. Next, we've got breathing rate, heart rate variability. These can also correspond with other measures of stress. And the reason that I put up a GIF and not just a still image is that you can see the breathing rate of this animal using a thermal camera. So that can be another use of the thermal camera, not only getting surface temperature, but also potentially getting breathing rate in some animals. The heart rate variability has a lot of promise in my eyes because it's responsive to both acute and chronic stressors. So you can get an idea of both longer term welfare and welfare right at this moment. It does require for most of these fitting the animal with a data logger. So it may be that that's a level of distress that you don't want to have for your animal. It kind of depends on the animal how distressing that would be. And finally, I've listed glucocorticoids here, often called stress hormones. And I've listed them because they're really sort of the most used indicator or physiological indicator. But a lot of times it does get misused or misinterpreted. So it does warrant, in particular, a lot of care and caution when being incorporated into your suite of indicators. Again, all of these are partial indicators, so they need to be used with some other type of indicator to get a full perspective. Whole animal physiological indicators, there are not very many of these at the moment, at least. So telomeres are a potential whole animal indicator for long-term welfare. They haven't been fully used to show acute welfare states. There's a possibility that they could, but so far they've only really been used as a cumulative welfare indicator for sort of the whole life of the individual. DNA methylation, which Dave talked about extensively, so I'm not going to say any more about. He's definitely more an expert on that than I am. Hippocampal volume is a good whole animal indicator, and it can be used both cumulatively or instantaneously. However, it requires the use of an MRI machine, and you are not going to be dragging an MRI machine out into the wild. So this is probably not going to work well for most free-living animals. It is possible that freshly deceased wild animals have the potential to provide some hippocampal biomarkers, but that hasn't yet been attempted, and so it's not yet validated. If your work includes collecting freshly dead animals, maybe you can consider testing that method. Okay, So we've talked about indicators. Now I want to talk a little bit about welfare metrics. And Andrea will be talking about this first metric much more extensively, so I don't want to take too much time on it. Metrics, again, are frameworks that incorporate data from multiple partial indicators, and they output some sort of single welfare score or state that we can measure or talk about. We don't measure it directly. Only the 5 domains has really been used on wild animals, and Andrea is going to be talking about that. It takes into account indicators of nutrition, the environment, health, behavior, and then it sort of combines all of those to estimate or infer the mental domain. So it aggregates all of these physical factors into a mental state to give you an idea of the affective state of the animal. So I'm going to leave it at that and let her give you more information about the 5 domains. Another one that has been used in farm animals, and this one collects animal-centric indicators. It's called welfare quality, and it creates a single welfare score. So this is a specific assessment that gets developed for each species. Over here you can look at some of these types of assessments that are done. And creating this assessment is quite time consuming. But once it has been created, it can be implemented much more quickly. And the nice thing about it is this very comparable between different farms. So this hasn't been applied to wild animals, and it would need quite a bit of work to calibrate it to be as informative as it is for farmed animals, but it has potential to sort of be used as a basis for a metric that could be developed for wild animals. And the last one that I'm going to talk about, these are not the only welfare metrics that exist, but the cumulative pain metric, it collates the types or causes of suffering. And here, when they say pain, they mean any type of suffering. It ranks the severity of the suffering, and then it provides a score that basically tells you how much of this animal's life has it been in pain and how severe has that pain been kind of overall. This is only developed to measure negative valence, but it is adaptable and it could be similarly developed to account for positive valence as well. So there hasn't been a metric that has been specifically developed for wild animals only. But it seems like a metric could be developed that is applicable and feasible across many taxa that would lead to good comparability between different wild animals. And my hope is that somebody over the next decade or so might try to develop a metric like that that's specific to wild animals. So I'm not going to talk about validating because that's what the next workshop is about. And here's the info about that if you want to take a look at our validation workshop. Hopefully you will be there, not next week, the week after that. Is that right? I think I've got the time right. Also, we just announced our challenge grants call for proposal, and one of the themes for it is validating valence indicators. So if you're interested in validation, I encourage you to go have a look at our call for proposals. So validation, extremely important, and assuming that something is reflecting welfare without thoroughly validating it has the potential to lead to large amounts of invalid and useless research, not to mention it would be a waste of money, a waste of potentially the animals suffering. So it's super important. And I would like to say validation is a spectrum. It's not completely binary. There are a lot of different methods that are available for validation. Each one has its own strengths and weaknesses, and I'm sure all of that is going to be discussed in much more detail in next week's workshop. So I hope that you're able to go to that one. My next slide is some resources that should help you with understanding more about the different types of measures that are available. And also, very importantly, I needed some cute pictures of banded mongooses, which are what I studied in my PhD. And I always want everybody to see them. So that's the really important part of this slide. And that is all. I thank you all very much for your time, and I would be delighted to answer any questions.